Experts examined 1880's photo of quiet Ohio town. What they found sent chills down their spines. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Ross County Historical Society, casting long shadows across the cluttered workspace where Melissa Carter sat hunched over her computer. At 26, she had the kind of focused intensity that came from spending too many late nights buried in dusty archives and forgotten documents. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. This internship was everything she'd hoped for, a chance to breathe life into history, one digitized photograph at a time. The statewide preservation project had been her professor's idea. "You have an eye for detail, Melissa," Dr. Richardson had said. "These old photographs need someone who can see beyond the surface." Now, 3 weeks into the project, she was beginning to understand what he meant. Each image told a story, captured a moment frozen in time when photography was still a marvel, when having your picture taken was an event worthy of Sunday clothes and solemn faces. She reached for another photograph from the manila folder marked 1883 Local Events. The image was slightly faded, its silver-toned surface showing the telltale signs of age, tiny scratches, water stains along the edges, and that peculiar sepia warmth that made everything look like a dream from another world. This particular photo showed a church picnic, she realized, squinting at the handwritten note on the back. St. Mary's Annual Gathering, July 1883. The scene was typical for the era. About 30 people were arranged in 3 rows on the church lawn, the women in long dark dresses with high necklines, the men in their Sunday best with stern expressions that suggested smiling wasn't yet fashionable in photographs. Children clustered around the adults' legs, some blurred from movement, others standing perfectly still as they'd been instructed. Melissa began the scanning process, adjusting the settings on her equipment to capture every detail. She'd learned that these old photographs often revealed surprises when examined closely, a face in a window, a detail in the background that the original photographer hadn't noticed, stories within stories waiting to be discovered. As the high-resolution scan appeared on her monitor, she leaned back in her chair and began her usual routine of examining every corner of the image. She'd catalog the clothing styles, note the architecture visible in the background, try to identify prominent town figures. It was detective work, really, piecing together fragments of a world that existed over a century ago. That's when she saw her. Dead center in the photograph, sitting cross-legged on the grass in front of the second row, was a little girl who couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Unlike the other children, who either looked uncomfortable or bored, this girl was staring directly into the camera lens with an expression that made Melissa's breath catch in her throat. It wasn't the girl's clothing that caught her attention, a simple white dress with dark trim, typical for the period. It wasn't even her posture, though she sat with unusual stillness for a child. It was her eyes. Large, dark, and unnaturally focused, they seemed to bore through the photograph, through the computer screen, straight into Melissa's soul. There was something else, too. While other figures in the photograph showed the typical softness of movement blur that plagued early photography, this child was razor-sharp. Every detail of her face was perfectly clear, from the dark curls framing her pale face to the precise fold of her dress. She looked as though she'd been carefully placed in the center of the composition, as though the photographer had arranged the entire scene around her. Melissa zoomed in, her heart beginning to race for reasons she couldn't quite name. The girl's expression was unsettling, not sad, not happy, but aware in a way that seemed impossible for someone so young. Her lips were slightly parted, as if she were about to speak, and her head was tilted at an angle that suggested she was listening to something no one else could hear. Strange, Melissa muttered, taking a screenshot of the zoomed image. She'd worked with hundreds of photographs from this era, and children rarely held still long enough to achieve such crystal clarity. The long exposure times required for 1880s photography meant that most children appeared as ghostly blurs, their restless energy captured as movement rather than form. She saved the file and reached for her notebook, jotting down her observations. As she wrote, she found herself glancing back at the screen repeatedly. Each time, the girl's gaze seemed to follow her, creating an uncomfortable sensation that made the hair on her arms stand up. Just your imagination, she told herself. "You've been staring at old photographs for too long." But as she tried to focus on her notes, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The sensation was so strong that she actually turned around to check if someone had entered the room behind her. The Historical Society was empty except for Mrs. Patterson, the elderly volunteer who worked the front desk, and she was 2 rooms away, her hearing aid making her oblivious to anything quieter than a fire alarm. Melissa turned back to her work, but her concentration was broken. She found herself studying the girl's face again, memorizing every detail. There was something familiar about her, though Melissa was certain she'd never seen this photograph before. The girl's features were delicate but strong, with high cheekbones and a small, determined chin. Her hair was dark and appeared to be carefully arranged, unusual for a child at an outdoor gathering. What bothered Melissa most was the girl's expression of complete awareness. Most children in Victorian photographs looked either frightened by the camera or bored by the long process of sitting still. This girl looked as though she understood exactly what was happening, as though she had chosen to be there, in that exact spot, at that exact moment. The afternoon wore on, but Melissa found it difficult to concentrate on her other work. She kept returning to the photograph, studying it from different angles, adjusting the contrast and brightness to see if she could glean any additional information. She examined the adults in the background, looking for family resemblances, but none of the faces shared the girl's distinctive features. By 5 o'clock, when the Historical Society closed for the day, Melissa had made little progress on her other photographs. She saved her work and gathered her things, but as she prepared to leave, she took one last look at the church picnic image on her screen. The girl was still there, still staring, still perfectly in focus while the world around her remained slightly soft and distant. As Melissa reached to turn off her computer, she could have sworn she saw the girl's eyes shift slightly, following her movement. She blinked hard and looked again. The girl was exactly as she had been, frozen in time, captured in silver and light. But the feeling of being watched persisted as Melissa locked up the building and walked to her car in the gathering dusk. That night, she dreamed of dark eyes and white dresses, of summer afternoons that stretched too long and shadows that moved when no one was looking. She woke feeling unrest, with the strange certainty that something important had happened, something that would change everything she thought she knew about the past. The next morning, she arrived at the Historical Society early, eager to continue her work but also strangely reluctant to face that photograph again. When she finally opened the file, the girl was still there, still watching, still perfectly clear in a world of blur and shadow. And that's when Melissa Carter realized that her internship had just become something far more complicated than digitizing old photographs. She was about to uncover a mystery that had been waiting over a century for someone to notice, someone to care enough to look beyond the surface of things. The girl in the photograph had found her audience at last. The obsession began innocently enough. Melissa told herself she was simply being thorough, that any good historian would follow up on an interesting detail. But as the days passed, she found herself scanning photographs with increasing urgency, her eyes searching every crowd, every family portrait, every formal gathering for a familiar face. She didn't have to wait long. 3 days after discovering the church picnic photograph, Melissa was working through a collection from nearby Greenfield when she found her again. This time, it was a wedding photo from 1886. The bride and groom standing stiffly on the steps of what appeared to be a courthouse, surrounded by relatives and friends. The image was slightly damaged, with a water stain obscuring part of the left side, but the right side was perfectly preserved. And there, standing at the edge of the crowd, was the same girl. Melissa's hands trembled as she adjusted the zoom. The girl was wearing a different dress now, dark blue instead of white, but everything else was identical. The same pale face, the same dark curls, the same intense stare directed straight at the camera. Most unsettling of all, she appeared to be exactly the same age as she had been 3 years earlier. "This is impossible," Melissa whispered to the empty room. Children grew, changed, aged. But this girl looked as though she had been lifted from the 1883 photograph and placed directly into the 1886 image without the passage of time affecting her in any way. Over the following weeks, Melissa's careful cataloging became a frantic search. She worked late into the evenings, ignoring Mrs. Patterson's gentle suggestions that she should go home and rest. She requested additional photograph collections from neighboring towns, expanding her search radius with each passing day. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and terrifying. Melissa found the girl in 11 more photographs spanning the decade from 1880 to 1890. Each image was from a different town within a 50-mile radius of the Historical Society: Chillicothe, Waverly, Piketon, Lucasville. The occasions varied: school photographs, family portraits, town celebrations, church gatherings. But in every single image, the girl appeared exactly the same age, wearing period-appropriate clothing but always managing to position herself where she could stare directly at the camera. What made the discovery even more disturbing was how she seemed to blend seamlessly into each scene. She wasn't an obvious addition or a jarring presence. In fact, Melissa realized that if she hadn't been looking for her specifically, she might have missed her entirely. The girl had a way of positioning herself in the natural flow of the composition, as though she belonged there, as though she had always been part of these families and communities. But when Melissa tried to trace her identity through the usual channels, she hit wall after wall. None of the photographs had captions identifying her. The family collections that included her images had no record of who she was or why she was present. It was as though she existed in the photographs but nowhere else in the historical record. Dr. Helen Moore, Melissa's mentor at the Historical Society, listened patiently as Melissa laid out her findings. The older woman examined the photographs with the methodical attention of someone who had spent decades working with historical images. "It's probably coincidence," Dr. Moore said finally, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Photography was still relatively new in rural areas during the 1880s. Traveling photographers would set up in different towns, and people would come from miles around to have their pictures taken. It's possible this girl was simply enthusiastic about the process. "But she doesn't age," Melissa insisted. "Look at this progression: 1880, 1883, 1886, 1890. She's identical in every image." Dr. Moore studied the photographs again, her expression growing more troubled. "Perhaps she was a local orphan who enjoyed being photographed. Children from difficult circumstances sometimes sought attention wherever they could find it. The photographers might have taken pity on her and included her in various sessions." The explanation felt hollow, but Melissa desperately wanted to believe it. She continued her research, this time focusing on records from local churches and orphanages. Most of the documents from that era were incomplete or had been lost to time, but she persisted, driven by a growing need to understand who this girl was and why she seemed to haunt every photograph she appeared in. It was while searching through church records from 1883 that Melissa found the first real clue. In the membership roster of St. Mary's Church, the same church where the original picnic had been held, she discovered a name that made her heart skip: Addie Marlin, age 9. The entry was brief, just a line in the careful handwriting of a long-dead church secretary. But beside Addie's name, in different ink, someone had added a note that sent chills down Melissa's spine. "Vanished by the well. No remains. No funeral." Melissa stared at the entry until her eyes watered. Here, finally, was a name to attach to the face that had been haunting her dreams. But the notation raised more questions than it answered. What well? When had she vanished? And why had no one claimed her body or held a funeral? As she photographed the church record with her phone, Melissa felt a strange sense of connection to the girl, to Addie. She had been real, had lived and breathed and attended church services in this very community. But she had also vanished without a trace, leaving behind only her presence in photographs and a cryptic note in a church ledger. The mystery was deepening, but Melissa finally had a starting point. Addie Marlin wasn't just a face in a photograph anymore. She was a person with a name, a story, and a tragedy that had been forgotten by time. Now Melissa had to find out what had really happened to her. The drive to the old Marlin property took Melissa through winding country roads that seemed untouched by time. Cornfields stretched endlessly on both sides, broken only by the occasional farmhouse or weathered barn. According to the county records, The Marlin family had owned 40 acres here until 1885, when the property was sold to pay debts. Now it was part of a larger farm operation, the original homestead long since demolished. Melissa parked beside a mailbox that read Griggs Farm, and walked up the gravel driveway toward a modest white house with a wraparound porch. She'd called ahead, explaining to Walter Griggs that she was researching local history for the Historical Society. What she hadn't mentioned was her true purpose. She wasn't sure the 80-year-old farmer would understand her obsession with a girl who had vanished over a century ago. Walter Griggs met her at the door, a tall, lean man with kind eyes and hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. Despite his age, he moved with the steady confidence of someone who had never stopped being useful. "You're the young lady from the Historical Society," he said, gesturing for her to come inside. "My wife's got coffee on. She's always excited when someone wants to hear the old stories." The kitchen was warm and welcoming, filled with the scent of fresh coffee and something sweet baking in the oven. Martha Griggs, Walter's wife, was a small woman with silver hair and bright eyes that missed nothing. She fussed over Melissa like she was a favorite granddaughter, insisting she try a piece of apple pie that was still warm from the oven. "Walter's grandmother used to tell the most wonderful stories about the old days," Martha said, settling into her chair with her own cup of coffee. "She lived to be 96, you know. Sharp as a tack until the very end." Walter nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. "Grandma Emma was just a girl herself back in the 1880s, but she remembered everything. Especially the strange things. She used to say that strange things stayed with you longer than ordinary ones." Melissa pulled out her notebook, trying to keep her voice casual. "I'm particularly interested in the Marlin family. I found their name in some old church records." The change in Walter's expression was immediate. His eyes grew distant, and he set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. The Marlins, yes, Grandma Emma used to talk about them. Especially about little Addie." Melissa's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What did she say about Addie?" Walter was quiet for a long moment, as if gathering memories from the deep places where old stories lived. "Grandma Emma said Addie was different from other children. Quiet, but clever. Always watching, always listening. She had a way of knowing things before they happened, if you know what I mean." Martha leaned forward, her own eyes bright with interest. "What kind of things?" "Oh, she'd know when the traveling peddlers were coming before anyone saw them on the road. She'd know when storms were coming before the sky even clouded over. That sort of thing. But what fascinated her most was the new photography equipment that started coming through the area." Melissa's pulse quickened. "Photography equipment?" "Oh yes," Walter continued, warming to his story. "This was when photography was still new, you understand. Most folks around here had never seen a camera before. But Addie, she was drawn to it like a moth to flame. Grandma Emma said she would follow those traveling photographers around, asking questions, wanting to understand how the pictures worked." Walter stood and walked to the window, looking out over the fields where the Marlin house had once stood. "She was particularly fascinated by one photographer who came through regularly. A man named, what was his name, Martha?" "Thomas something," Martha replied. "Thomas Geller, I think." "That's right. Thomas Geller. He was known for taking beautiful portraits of children. Had a real artistic eye, according to Grandma Emma. Addie would follow his wagon whenever he came to town, begging to be in his pictures." Melissa could barely contain her excitement. "What happened to her?" "The church records say she vanished." Walter's expression darkened. "That's the tragedy of it all. It was summer of 1883, one of the hottest on record. This photographer, Geller, had been in town for several days, taking pictures of different families. Addie had been following him around as usual, and on his last day, she followed his wagon when he left town." He paused, his voice becoming softer. "There was a terrible storm that night. Thunder and lightning like you wouldn't believe. When morning came, Addie's parents found her shoes by the old well behind their house, but no sign of her. They searched for days, dragged the well, combed every inch of the property. Nothing." What about the photographer? Melissa asked. Gone. Left town that same night, apparently. Some folks thought maybe he'd taken her with him, but there was no evidence of that. Others thought she'd fallen in the well, but like I said, they never found anything. Martha shook her head sadly. That poor family. They never got over it. Her mother would sit by that well every day until the day she died, waiting for Addie to come home. Walter returned to his chair, his expression troubled. But here's the strange part, the part that always bothered Grandma Emma. After Addie disappeared, people started seeing her in photographs. Not new ones, you understand, but ones that had already been taken. Family portraits where she hadn't been before, group pictures where she suddenly appeared in the background. Melissa's blood ran cold. People saw her in existing photographs? That's what Grandma Emma claimed. She said it was like Addie was trying to tell them something, trying to show them where she was or what had happened to her. But nobody could make sense of it. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of an old clock on the wall. Melissa stared at her notebook, her mind racing. If Walter's story was true, then Addie's appearances in photographs weren't just coincidence. They were something else entirely, a message, perhaps, or a plea. Mr. Griggs, she said carefully, do you think Addie is still out there? I mean, still appearing in photographs? Walter looked at her with sharp eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable with. Young lady, I think some mysteries are meant to stay buried. But if you're asking me whether Addie Marlin is at peace, I'd say that depends on whether anyone's listening to what she's trying to tell them. As Melissa drove back to town, Walter's words echoed in her mind. Addie wasn't just haunting photographs, she was trying to communicate. The question was, what was she trying to say? The university archive smelled of old paper and forgotten time. Melissa had called ahead to the Ohio Historical Research Center, explaining that she was tracking down information about traveling photographers from the 1880s. The librarian, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named David Chen, had been intrigued enough to pull several boxes of materials for her review. We have quite a collection of photographic materials from that era, he explained, leading her to a quiet corner table. Most of it came from estate donations over the years. People cleaning out their grandparents' attics, that sort of thing. Melissa's heart raced when she saw the name on the first box. Thomas Geller Collection Personal Papers and Photographic Materials, 1875 to 1892. Inside were dozens of glass plate negatives, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, along with correspondence, business ledgers, and what appeared to be several personal journals. She started with the journals, handling them with the reverence they deserved. The leather covers were worn soft with age, and the pages were filled with Thomas Geller's careful handwriting in faded brown ink. The entries were dated, beginning in 1875 when Geller would have been just starting his career. The early entries were mundane, lists of towns visited, prices charged, notes about lighting conditions and equipment maintenance. But as Melissa read deeper into the collection, she began to understand the man behind the camera. Geller wasn't just a businessman. He was an artist who saw photography as a sacred trust, a way to preserve memory and honor the lives of ordinary people. Each photograph is a small immortality, he had written in 1878. I am not merely capturing light on silver, but stealing moments from time itself, preserving them for generations yet unborn. It was in the 1883 journal that Melissa found what she was looking for. The entry was dated July 15th, just a few days before Addie's disappearance. The girl who always watched. She has been following my wagon for 3 days now, this curious child with the dark eyes and solemn face. She asks endless questions about the camera, about how the light becomes memory. There is something unsettling about her intensity, as though she sees things others cannot. Today she begged me to teach her about the chemicals, about how the images appear in the developing bath. I told her it was no place for a child, but she persists. She says she wants to understand how people can live forever in pictures. Melissa's hands trembled as she turned the page. The next entry was dated July 18th. I have made a terrible mistake. The storm came suddenly, as summer storms do, and I lost her. The girl, Addie, she told me her name was Addie, had been helping me pack my equipment when the lightning began. I told her to run home, that her parents would be worried. She looked at me with those dark eyes and said, "But you haven't taken my picture yet." The rain was coming down in sheets, and I couldn't see her clearly. I thought she had gone home. I should have made certain. I should have walked her back myself. The entry continued. I cannot sleep. I keep thinking about her final words, "Promise me you won't forget." How could I forget such a child? But I fear something terrible has happened. The townsfolk came to my camp this morning, asking if I had seen her. I told them about the storm, about how she had been helping me, but they looked at me with such suspicion. They think I have taken her. They think I am some kind of monster who steals children. Melissa turned several pages, looking for more entries about Addie. What she found was even more disturbing. I cannot leave this place, not yet. Something compels me to stay, to search for her. I have been developing the photographs I took here, and in several of them, I see her face. Not as a subject I photographed, but as though she appeared in the images after they were taken. This is impossible, of course. Light cannot lie, and yet, there she is, standing in the background of the Henderson family portrait, watching from the edge of the church gathering. Always watching, always waiting. The entries became more erratic as the days passed. I understand now what she meant. She didn't want me to take her picture, she wanted me to let her live in the pictures. Somehow, in my grief and guilt, I have been including her in my work. When I develop the plates, I find myself adding her image to the compositions, creating double exposures that place her in scenes where she was never present. It is a form of madness, I suppose, but also a kind of mourning. She wanted to be remembered, and so I remember her in the only way I know how. The final entry about Addie was dated August 30th, 1883. I leave this place tomorrow. I have done what I can for her memory, placing her image in a dozen photographs from towns throughout the region. Future generations will see her face and wonder who she was. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is what she wanted all along, not to be forgotten, but to be seen, to be remembered by strangers who will never know her story but will carry her image in their minds. Melissa sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the revelation. Thomas Geller had been deliberately placing Addie's image in photographs after her disappearance, creating the very mystery that had brought Melissa here. But the journal suggested something even more profound, that Addie herself had somehow guided this process, that her presence in the photographs was not just Geller's artistic tribute but something deeper, something that transcended the normal boundaries between life and death. She photographed the relevant journal pages with her phone, her mind racing with questions. Had Geller been driven by guilt to memorialize Addie in this way? Or had something supernatural compelled him to continue including her image in his work? As she prepared to leave the archive, Davidson approached her table. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked. Melissa nodded, still processing what she had read. "More than I expected. Do you know what happened to Thomas Geller after 1883? David consulted his computer. According to our records, he continued photographing throughout Ohio and Pennsylvania until 1892, when he apparently retired. He died in 1898 in Pittsburgh. His final photographs were donated to us by his nephew in the 1940s. Final photographs? A series of portraits he took shortly before his death. Rather unusual work, actually. Very artistic, very emotional. He called the series Ghosts of Memory. Melissa felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you still have those photographs?" David nodded. "They're in the climate-controlled storage. Would you like to see them?" 20 minutes later, Melissa was looking at Thomas Geller's final artistic statement. The photographs were haunting, ethereal images of children who seemed to exist between worlds, their faces partially obscured by shadow and light. And in the center of the collection was a single portrait that made her heart stop. It was Addie, photographed with perfect clarity, her dark eyes looking directly at the camera with an expression of profound gratitude. Below the image, in Geller's careful handwriting, was a simple inscription. "At peace at last." For the first time since this mystery began, Melissa felt she truly understood. Addie hadn't been haunting photographs. She had been waiting for someone to tell her story, to give her the recognition and remembrance she had never received in life. Thomas Geller had tried to do this through his art, but it wasn't enough. Addie needed more than shadows and double exposures. She needed someone to speak her name and honor her memory properly. Melissa knew exactly what she had to do. The Ross County Historical Society had never hosted an exhibit quite like this one. Melissa spent 3 weeks meticulously planning every detail, working late into the evenings to ensure that Addie's story would be told with the dignity and respect it deserved. Dr. Helen Moore had been skeptical at first, questioning whether an exhibit centered around one missing child from 1883 would draw enough interest to justify the effort. "It's not just about one child," Melissa had explained, spreading the photographs across the conference table. "It's about how we remember the forgotten, how photography became a form of immortality for people who might otherwise have vanished from history entirely." When Dr. Moore saw the complete collection, 13 photographs spanning a decade, Thomas Geller's journal entries, and the historical context Melissa had painstakingly researched, her skepticism transformed into enthusiasm. "This is remarkable work, Melissa. You've uncovered something truly special here." The exhibit opening was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in early October. Melissa had sent notices to local newspapers and posted announcements on community bulletin boards, but she wasn't prepared for the response. By noon, an hour before the official opening, a line of people stretched from the Historical Society's front door to the parking lot. Inside, Melissa had arranged the display with careful attention to both chronology and emotional impact. The centerpiece was the original 1883 church picnic photograph, enlarged and mounted with a spotlight that drew visitors' eyes immediately to Addie's clear, watchful face. Around the room, the other photographs were displayed in chronological order, each one accompanied by detailed information about the location, date, and circumstances. But the real heart of the exhibit was the biographical section Melissa had created. Working with church records, newspaper archives, and Walter Griggs' family stories, she had reconstructed as much of Addie's life as possible. Born Adelaide Marlin on March 15, 1874, to Samuel and Mary Marlin, the youngest of 3 children, described by those who knew her as unusually bright and possessed of an old soul. Her fascination with the traveling photographers who visited their rural community. Her dreams of understanding how pictures could make people live forever. Thomas Geller's journal excerpts were displayed in glass cases, his elegant handwriting telling the story of a guilt-ridden artist who had tried to honor a lost child through his work. Melissa had included his final photograph of Addie, the one inscribed, "At peace at last," as the emotional climax of the exhibit. "Ladies and gentlemen," Melissa began, addressing the crowd that had gathered for the opening ceremony. "Today we give a voice to someone who has been silent for over a century. Adelaide Addie Marlin was 9 years old when she disappeared in the summer of 1883. She left behind no grave, no funeral, no formal memorial. But she did leave behind something else, her image, preserved by a photographer who understood that every person deserves to be remembered." She gestured toward the photographs surrounding them. For decades, people noticed Addie's face appearing in these images without understanding who she was or why she seemed to watch them from across the years. Today, we give her back her name, her story, and her place in our community's history. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Visitors moved through the exhibit with unusual quiet, drawn into Addie's story with an intensity Melissa hadn't expected. Children pressed their faces close to the photographs, trying to meet Addie's gaze. Adults stood in contemplative silence, reading every word of the biographical information. But it was the elderly visitors who affected Melissa most deeply. Several people approached her throughout the afternoon, sharing their own family stories about children who had died young or disappeared without explanation. An elderly woman named Ruth Henderson broke down in tears when she realized that one of the photographs showed her great-great-grandparents' wedding, with Addie standing quietly in the background. "I never knew she was there," Ruth whispered, staring at the image. "I've looked at this photograph 1,000 times, and I never saw her." But now that I know her story, I can't look away. The most moving moment came when Walter Griggs arrived with his wife Martha and a small group of relatives. Walter moved slowly through the exhibit, nodding approvingly at the information Melissa had compiled. When he reached Thomas Geller's final photograph of Addie, he stood for a long time in silence. "Grandma Emma would have been so pleased," he finally said to Melissa. "She always said Addie deserved better than to be forgotten." Martha had brought something special, a small photo album that had belonged to her husband's grandmother. "We found this in the attic after you visited," she explained, opening the album to a page Melissa had never seen. "Grandma Emma must have gotten it from the Marlin family after they moved away." The photograph was different from all the others. In this one, Addie was smiling, the only image Melissa had seen where the girl looked truly happy. She was standing in a garden, wearing a white dress decorated with small flowers, her arms outstretched as if she were about to embrace whoever was taking the picture. "This was taken just weeks before she disappeared," Martha said softly. "Look at the back." Melissa turned the photograph over and found an inscription in faded pencil. "Our sweet Addie, who loved pictures and believed they could make people live forever. May she rest in the light she so admired." As the afternoon wore on, something remarkable happened. People began bringing flowers. First just a few, daisies and wildflowers picked from nearby fields. But soon the area around Addie's biographical display was transformed into an impromptu memorial. Visitors left notes, drawings from children, and small tokens of remembrance. By evening, when the exhibit officially closed for the day, Melissa stood in the quiet gallery surrounded by the evidence of a community's response to a story that had waited 140 years to be told. Addie Marlin was no longer a mysterious face in old photographs. She was a person with a name, a history, and a place in the collective memory of everyone who had heard her story. For the first time since discovering that first photograph, Melissa felt truly at peace. She had given Addie what she had been seeking all along, not just recognition, but genuine remembrance, the kind that transforms forgotten children into beloved members of a community that spans generations. The exhibit would run for 3 months, but Melissa knew that Addie's story would live much longer than that. It would be passed down through families, shared at community gatherings, and remembered whenever people looked at old photographs and wondered about the faces staring back at them from the past. 3 months later, as the final day of the exhibit approached, Melissa found herself reluctant to take down the displays. The community response had exceeded every expectation. Thousands of visitors had come to learn about Addie's story, and the Historical Society had received dozens of donations of family photographs and documents from the same era. More importantly, the exhibit had sparked conversations about local history that continued long after people left the building. Local schools had made field trips to see the exhibit, and Melissa had watched children connect with Addie's story in ways that surprised their teachers. One young girl, about Addie's age, had visited 3 times with her grandmother, each time spending long minutes staring into Addie's eyes in the photographs. "She looks like she's trying to tell us something," the girl had said during her last visit. "But I think she's happy now that we're listening." The comment had stayed with Melissa, echoing the feeling she'd had throughout the exhibit's run. There was something different about the photographs now, something she couldn't quite put into words. When she looked at Addie's face, she no longer felt the unsettling sensation of being watched. Instead, there was a sense of calm, of gratitude, of completion. On the exhibit's final afternoon, Melissa stood alone in the gallery, preparing to begin the careful process of packing away the photographs and documents. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting warm light across the displays. She decided to take one last careful look at the original 1883 church picnic photograph, the image that had started this entire journey. As she approached the enlarged photograph, something made her pause. The lighting in the room was different from usual, softer and more golden, and it seemed to bring out details she had never noticed before. She moved closer, studying Addie's face with the same intensity she had brought to the image months earlier. But now she saw something different. Addie's posture, which had always seemed rigid and watchful, appeared more relaxed. Her head was tilted at a slightly different angle, Or perhaps it was just the way the afternoon light fell across the photograph. Most remarkably, her expression seemed gentler, less urgent. The desperate awareness that had once made Melissa's skin crawl was gone, replaced by something that could only be described as contentment. It was probably her imagination, Melissa told herself. After months of staring at these photographs, after learning Addie's story and sharing it with thousands of people, she was naturally seeing what she wanted to see. The human mind had a way of creating patterns and meaning where none existed. But as she continued to study the image, she became convinced that something had indeed changed. The girl in the photograph was no longer pleading to be seen. She was simply present, finally at peace with her place in the world. Melissa pulled out her phone and took a photo of the exhibit photograph, then compared it to the original image she had taken months earlier. Side by side, the differences were subtle but undeniable. The angle of Addie's head, the set of her shoulders, the expression in her eyes, all were slightly but definitively different. "Impossible," she whispered to the empty room. But even as she said it, she remembered Thomas Geller's words from his journal. Light cannot lie. Perhaps light could change, though. Perhaps images could evolve when they were finally seen with understanding and compassion. That evening, Melissa worked late into the night, carefully packing away the photographs and documents that would return to their various archives and collections. But she made one important decision. Thomas Geller's final photograph of Addie, the one inscribed, "At peace at last," would remain at the Ross County Historical Society as part of their permanent collection. More significantly, she commissioned a local artist to create a formal memorial plaque that would be installed in the Historical Society's main hallway. The bronze plaque bore Addie's photograph, the smiling image that Martha Griggs had shared, along with carefully chosen words. In memory of Adelaide, Addie, Marlin 1874 to 1883. A girl who loved the camera, and now is remembered by it. She believed that photographs could make people live forever. Through the kindness of strangers and the passage of time, she has found the immortality she sought. Her story reminds us that every face and every photograph was once a person with dreams, hopes, and the desire to be remembered with love. The installation ceremony was small and private, attended only by Dr. Moore, Walter and Martha Griggs, and a few community members who had been most touched by Addie's story. As the plaque was unveiled, Melissa felt a profound sense of completion. For weeks afterward, visitors to the Historical Society would pause at the memorial, reading Addie's story and studying her smiling face. Children would ask their parents who she was, and the story would be told again, ensuring that Addie's memory would continue to live in the hearts and minds of people she had never met but who had learned to care about her across the span of more than a century. Melissa returned to her regular work at the Historical Society, continuing to digitize photographs and preserve local history. But her experience with Addie had changed her approach to the work. She looked at every face and every photograph with new eyes, wondering about their stories, their dreams, their hopes for how they would be remembered. And sometimes, when the afternoon light fell just right across her computer screen, she would pause in her work and smile, knowing that somewhere in the vast collection of images she was preserving, other Addies might be waiting for their stories to be told. On her last day at the Historical Society, 6 months after the exhibit had closed, Melissa walked past Addie's memorial one final time. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, casting warm light across the bronze plaque and making Addie's photographed face seem almost alive. As she reached for the door handle, Melissa could have sworn she heard something. A whisper of gratitude carried on the autumn breeze, a child's voice saying thank you across the years. She turned back toward the memorial, but there was only silence and sunlight. She walked out into the afternoon, peaceful in the knowledge that some stories, once told with love and understanding, could finally rest. Addie Marlin had found her place in history, not as a ghost haunting old photographs, but as a beloved child whose memory would live on in the hearts of a community that had learned to see her not as a mystery to be solved, but as a person to be cherished and remembered. The girl who had loved cameras had finally found the immortality she had sought, not through the technology of silver and light, but through the more powerful magic of human compassion and the simple act of being seen, understood, and loved.